Hola amigos! Hola amigas! Today I wanted to show you how we can sculpt a stylized character entirely in Blender, from a simple sphere to the final high poly mesh, including painting. This workflow video will help you understand how it works in Blender and why you should use it now, instead of other softwares. Yes, Blender is mature for that kind of work, so let's go. Let's start from the beginning by talking about references. When you're sculpting something, you always want to use references. And in Blender, it's quite easy to set that up. We can have an image that we can place in our scene, move around, and always have nearby. To do that, if you press Shift plus A and click in your scene, you can see the image section with a bunch of choices, going from reference to empty image. I'm going to pick a reference, which is the most common and basic one. Here, you just have to pick a local file that you have saved. And here we have our beautiful ISMA. By default, it will be oriented based on your current camera or viewport view, but you can reset that from the Item tab and place it wherever you want. So let's do that here. Then I'm going to bring in a simple sphere, and this is going to be the base mesh we're going to use. Yes, we're really starting from scratch. At that point, I'm going to switch to the Sculpting workspace. You can stick to the Layout workspace or use your own custom workspace, but what's cool about the Sculpting workspace is that it gets rid of the grid and all the other things we don't want to be bothered with. You can see at the bottom that we have the brush library, where you can pick and use different kinds of brushes during your sculpting process. In addition, I also use PureRef, which is a free and really cool little piece of software that I'm sure you're aware of. You can have a bunch of additional references that you can dock on top of any window or anywhere on your desktop. I combine that with the main reference I have in my scene, just to get the character's shapes from different angles as well. So this is all the brushes we can have access to, and you can just click on them and choose whatever you want. I'm going to mainly use the grab brush and this clay strips brush as well. Those are kind of my main brushes. The first thing you want to check when you're about to start your sculpt is to set up your UI and look at the shortcuts for each brush. In Blender, it's located in the Preferences under Key Map. It's kind of a specific name because all the things you see named Active Brush Asset are the ones that you want to look into. This is where you can find a specific brush with a specific key map assigned to it. It's under the Sculpt category, and you can see that we already have some of the brushes mapped to shortcuts. When you unfold one of them, you can see that it's targeting the path of the Essentials Asset library with a specific brush. Here we have the Draw brush, and we also have the Grab brush with the G key assigned to it, which allows us to quickly switch to it. So now let's take an example. The Grab brush is great, but you can see that it only affects a really local area. I really like to use the Grab brush, which is more of a full 2D based view brush. It will affect everything you see from the front view, but also the geometry behind it. So let's assign a shortcut to it. So inside this Preferences tab, I'm going to delete any filter and I'm going to go into 3D View, then Sculpt, and then the Sculpt Global subcategory. In the first dropdown, I can access the Add New button, and this is where I can create a new shortcut for a brush. So let's assign the proper settings here. I'm going to select Brush Asset Activate. I can also look at other brushes to see how they are set up. Here, I'm going to use the 2 key on my keyboard to have quick access to it. Now I need to define the asset library and the relative path. To quickly get access to the relative path, I can, as I mentioned, look at an already assigned key map brush. I can simply copy the relative path and change the end of it. So this is the mask, and you can see that it's Grab 2D. Be careful here because it's case and space sensitive, so let's paste exactly the same name, Grab 2D. Then I'm going to choose the correct library, which is the Essentials library, and that's it. That's enough to set up the shortcut. Now, if I go back into my scene and press 2, you can see that I have my shortcut set up to access this specific brush. So you get the idea. You can repeat the same process for any of your workflow brushes and set up your own shortcuts to make sculpting much faster. You can use shortcuts to adjust the size of the brush by pressing F and dragging the mouse. That's super convenient and super important. You can also press Shift plus F to control the fall off of the brush. So this is the inner circle that you can see here, while the outside circle is the overall size of the brush. You know that shortcuts are really important, whether you're animating or sculpting, so that's why I'm taking the time to present them to you. Everything can be retrieved from the top left corner of the UI, where you can change the brush and adjust different settings for it. Under the brush section, for example, this is where you can activate front faces only, which we're going to use later. This means that when you sculpt, it won't affect the back faces of a thin mesh. You can adjust textures as well, and under stroke, you can adjust the stability, similar to lazy mouse in ZBrush. You can further adjust the fall-off, cursor color, and so on. As I mentioned, all the brushes can be accessed from this tab. On the right-hand side, you can also find a bunch of additional tool settings directly from there. Some settings can also be accessed from the top right corner, such as Symmetry, Dyntopo, Remesh, and other options. I'm going to talk about those right after. Other settings and brushes can also be accessed from the left sidebar. For example, this is where you can find masks, trim, and additional brushes and tools for things like cloth and color fill. Now, if we focus on the top right corner of the UI, this is where, through this menu, you can activate symmetry based on the world axis. I'm mainly going to use the X-axis here, so you just have to enable it, and now, when we sculpt, it will take into account the axis you chose for symmetry. As you can see, we have a really low resolution for the sphere, and this is where we're going to dive into Dyntopo or Remesh. To make it simple, if you know ZBrush, Dyntopo is similar to Sculptress, while Remesh is more like Dynamesh. Dyntopo will automatically and dynamically adjust the resolution of your mesh, based on the brush stroke you're doing on it. So if I activate it and start sculpting, you can see that dynamically I'm getting more triangles and therefore more resolution to work with. Everything is dynamic, which is why it's called Dyntopo. Depending on the size of your brush and the stroke you're doing, you can adjust the overall resolution, and you can go further into the Dyntopo menu and adjust all of that with the detail size and other settings. Then we have Remesh, which is based on the voxel size. You can reset and remesh the overall topology of your mesh. So if I sculpt something first, you can see that it's just stretching the topology here. And if you press R and drag your mouse, you can dynamically change the final voxel resolution and size that you want to apply to your mesh. Then, by pressing Ctrl+R, you apply the remesh. As I mentioned, if you're familiar with ZBrush, it's a bit like dragging on the side of the mesh with the remesh or Dynamesh workflow to adjust the resolution. But here you just have to press Ctrl+R. I personally prefer this method, maybe because I'm more familiar with it, but I like to manage the resolution myself and avoid having it change dynamically. I prefer to start with a low resolution and increase it step by step as I need more detail. So that's really up to you, depending on which workflow you're more familiar with or which one you prefer. For this video, I'm going to go with Remesh. So I'm going to mainly use the R shortcut to adjust the voxel size, and then Ctrl+R to apply the new resolution to the mesh. So now, before starting sculpting, I want to adjust the reference images a bit. I want to adjust the reference image here because, as you can see, I don't need all this empty space. I just want to focus on the head. Unfortunately, in Blender, we don't have any crop settings for image references. We could use a mesh plane, but that would involve switching to another viewport mode, and I don't want that. I want to stay with the classical viewport display. So what I'm going to do is simply change the image and grab a new one that I directly cropped from PureRef. I'm going to stick to that one, place it nearby my sphere, and orient it a bit. And then I can start using the Remesh tool, adjust the resolution, and press Ctrl+R to apply it. And let's go. So as I just said, I'm going to orient the image a bit to have a more straight-on view of the face. Then I go back to sculpt mode by pressing Ctrl+Tab. Here I'm mainly going to use the Grab 2D brush to block out the rough shape of the skull and the overall shape of the character. And that's really important. Always start simple, with simple shapes and low resolution before jumping into the details. Details are added on top of the structure. And if your structure is wrong, everything is going to be wrong in the end. So that's the initial part, and it's the most important one, so take your time. It often looks like nothing at first, and this is where you shouldn't get discouraged by it. You need to understand the process. It's normal for it to look like nothing in the beginning, but in the end, you'll see the result. So it's always the same thing as I mentioned. I'm just using R to set the voxel resolution and adjust the new resolution of the mesh, and Ctrl+R to apply it. The eyes are really important for adjusting the overall structure of the skull and the head in general. That's why I am starting quite early to roughly sculpt the eye sockets and also the nose. Same thing for the mouth. Again, first I'm just placing the cavity, and then we're going to add more details and shapes around it, just to place the major elements of the character. Here, I'm using our lovely Isma as the reference. For sculpting, apart from the 2D grab brush, as you can see, I'm always using this clay strips brush. It's kind of simulating a real sculpting stroke, and it's a classic brush that you can find in ZBrush as well. I really like it because you can see how you can subtract or add matter to the mesh. And if you've ever sculpted in real life, you can see that it's kind of the same process. You add or subtract matter piece by piece, like that. It feels more representative of the actual sculpting process, and that's why I really appreciate using it. This kind of planar brush is also super useful to block out even more and simplify the shape. It's kind of like doing a clay polish effect. I'm going to iterate and jump between these different brushes: the clay strips, flatten, move, and 2D grab brushes. I'm adjusting the jaw and some of the lower lip, and I'm adding a bit more resolution overall to start adjusting the structure in more depth and begin building the secondary features. Then I want to extract the neck. There are several possibilities here. You can use Edit mode, select a few vertices, and just drag the selection along the axis. Or what you can do as well is stay in Sculpt mode and simply mask the area you want. Then, by using the grab brush, I'm just pulling out this matter, and this becomes the base of the neck. You can also do another thing, which is add another individual mesh, join them together, and then remesh everything on top of that. Here, after extracting the neck, I'm using the trim brush to create a nice cut at the bottom of it. Then I can just start sculpting and adjusting things. You can see that at the bottom I have a new color. This is because of the trim brush, which automatically creates some face sets. You can go into the face sets menu and simply reset it from visible and it will get rid of it. This can be handy if you want to isolate a specific area. You can adjust the brush based on face sets. Sometimes I use it when I'm rigging and I want to adjust something like the lips without affecting other areas. It's kind of like a polygroup functionality, but in Blender. And here I'm just finishing up by adjusting and roughly blocking out the neck. So I'm going to continue adjusting everything a bit in the mouth area, adjusting the resolution and continuing to refine everything. Then I'm going to jump into object mode and I'm going to add a sphere to start placing the eyes. I'm always trying to switch between perspective and orthographic views. It's better to sometimes use a non-perspective view to avoid proportion mistakes when you're building your character or sculpting. It's really easy to switch between sculpt mode and object mode and start working more like you would in a traditional DCC tool. I can just grab and move a shape, and that's why I really love Blender. It's very flexible, and at any moment you can jump into a different workspace without the hurdle of having a difficult UI or UX. Here I'm just adding a new empty. That's going to be my Symmetry axis. So I'm just going to quickly rename it and adjust the collection and the outliner here, so everything is better organized and easier to manage. For the eyes, I'm just adding a mirror modifier with the Symmetry axis, so I can have perfect symmetry on the eyes. Then I can start further adjusting their position and go back into sculpt mode to refine them. So from the newly positioned eyes, I'm going to build up the eyelids and adjust the upper part of the zygomatic arch. And I will always keep an eye on the reference image. Sometimes I just hide it so I have a better workspace to work with. By hiding the reference, I can better see and fill out the shapes underneath. I'm not moving the eyes anymore. Instead, I'm going to readjust and rebuild the structure around them. She has really big eyes and not the prettiest ones, right? And that's really cool for this kind of stylized character. It makes it easier to play with the shapes and it's really fun to create everything. One thing to keep in mind when you're creating the eyes is to avoid having these shapes go too deep into the skull. So I just need to add a bit more volume around them. I'm going to sculpt around the eyelids to create a clear distinction between the brow line and the eyes. Then I'm going to build up the eyebrows around that. This will help me readjust and correctly redefine the overall structure. And as you can see, the resolution is still quite low, and that's completely fine. As I mentioned, the structure should stay at a lower resolution, and the details come afterwards. Even with the lower resolution, you can already see some pretty crisp details. I know that we always want to jump into the details too soon, but we need to resist that temptation and build the structure first. She has a really nice character design, and I love it, so it was a real pleasure to spend time sculpting her. Right now, I'm just keeping symmetry enabled all the way through. We're going to break the symmetry at the end. So it's not that we're trying to make the final result perfectly symmetrical, it's just intentional because we don't want to spend twice as much time working on one side and then the other. So let's benefit from the 3D tools we have available rather than working like in real life, where you have to build everything without a symmetry tool. We'll continue adjusting everything and we'll address the asymmetry at the end. Now, in addition to the eyes, to continue further adjusting the overall shape of our lovely Yzma, I need to add all the other elements, mainly the teeth. For the teeth, and because we're in Blender, and it's really easy to switch between different modes, as I mentioned, I can just go into Object mode and add a curve, then go back into Edit mode and adjust the vertices of this curve. The idea here is to roughly place the curve along the upper part of the jaw. Then I can subdivide it and add another vertex in the middle of the curve, just to create a nice and simple arc. Then, in the curve properties, I'm going to add some extrude value under the geometry tab, and quite quickly we can see the beginning of the teeth coming out. I'm placing it by hand, so it's not perfectly symmetrical, but that's fine. As we can see, she has big teeth that aren't really symmetrical, and we are going to play with that afterward. Once I'm happy with the placement of the curve and its extrusion, I'm going to duplicate it and place the same thing at the bottom, just to roughly establish the idea of the final teeth placement. The next step is to convert those curves into actual meshes. I'll always keep the original curves in my outliner in case I want to go back at any time and adjust the overall shape. Now, based on the mesh, I'm just going to select parts of it and extrude the faces. This will help me create the gaps between the teeth so they can catch some shadows. I don't have to manually sculpt those gaps because they are basically straight lines, and it's always a bit of a pain to do that without having a crazy amount of resolution on the mesh. That's why I'm going for a more traditional approach here, using traditional modeling tools. But at any time, even if you have a low resolution mesh or you're starting in modeling mode, you can jump into Sculpt mode and adjust everything quite easily. I'm also adding the canine teeth on the outside, making them a bit more pointy. I'm going to add a bit of edge looping to get better smoothing and normal shading. Then again, I'm going to duplicate and rotate them for the lower teeth. I'm just going to spend some time rotating and adjusting them, and also use Sculpt mode to perfectly place the teeth based on the reference. The goal is to give them a more natural look rather than having everything perfectly symmetrical. And that's it for the teeth. Now we can move on to the rest of the head. And then I continue refining everything, increasing the resolution a bit, and working with something smaller and more detailed. I'm going to add a bit of ears at the back afterward, but first I'm adjusting the chin and the jaw, looking at the character from every angle, and working a bit on her perfect and beautiful lips. It's really just a matter of switching between tools, adjusting things, and using the same brushes, as you can see. I'm also using this one to further adjust and carve specific shapes and lines. This will also depend on the final resolution, because if you carve too much and then remesh again, everything can just merge together and kind of mess up what you've been working on. Then it's time to use masks. As you can see here, for example, I can mask a specific area and then work on another part without affecting the masked area. This can be really handy when you want to bring a specific part closer to another one without deforming the surrounding areas. After spending a bit of time on the jaw, I start adjusting the lower eyelid because she has a really nice and big smile. The lower eyelid is kind of compressed between the zygomatic arch and the eye itself, so we get some really interesting shapes that are a bit different from a typical human face. As you can see, I'm starting to increase the resolution to add more details overall. And then, as I mentioned, I'm just placing a rough start for the ears. We don't really see them in the final character, so just having a rough shape there that we can attach the earrings to afterward should be enough. So I've got something solid before jumping into really tiny and small details. Now I'm going to create the headdress, and I'm not going to use the one from the reference. I'm going to use the classical one. The headdress that we usually think of when we think of Yzma, the big headdress with the feather and so on. So I'm just starting by adding a cylinder for a rough placement as the base. And then I'm going to use curves to have something easier to manage. I'm just playing with some extrusions and trying to figure out the best settings. You can adjust the thickness of the curve at specific points using S. And with the tilt functionality, you can also adjust its orientation. What I'm going to do here is increase the thickness of the curve, then convert it into a mesh, so I can sculpt and further adjust the shape by hand, just to give it a more organic feel. I'm using several different brushes, including the inflate brush, to give a bit of extra thickness to specific areas and edges of the headdress, and then I'm just making all the little adjustments to get the overall shape I want. And this is a perfect example here because the mesh is quite thin. If I'm sculpting with a large brush size, I'm going to hit the back face of the mesh, and I don't want that. So this is where, under the brush settings, you can activate front faces only. When you sculpt, it won't affect the back parts of the mesh. As you can see here, if I start sculpting now, it won't affect the back part of it. And that's really important when it comes to sculpting, knowing where these settings are and how they affect your workflow. So I'm going to try to merge the shape of the root of the headdress with the rest of it by adding some thickness. Then I'm just creating additional strokes to give it a bit more shape and an organic feel. I'm moving around the whole thing, making small adjustments here and there, and continuing to refine the overall shape. I'm going to smooth the edge, and what I'm going to use as well is the pinch brush. This can help reduce the effect of too thick edges, where you can see the manual deformation when you move the shape. It's great to use it to give the sculpt a more defined look, rather than making everything too soft when you're working with specific brushes. The pinch brush can come in handy in many different scenarios. Here you can see that it's adding a bit more of a cloth feel, rather than making it look too smooth and thick. It's a little trick that works really well. By continuing to do this, you can see that now I have more of a clay polish style look. Just by working by hand, being patient, switching between different brushes, and playing with the pinch brush. To finalize the headdress, I'm going to extrude the root of it a bit to make it sit closer to the upper part of the head. Then I'm going to turn on smooth shading and adjust the top of the head, so it feels like the headdress is really sitting on top of it. And that could be it for the headdress. Now we can move on to the other parts. Now I'm going to work on the neck area with all the feathers around the neck. I've also added the reference I'm going to use for that, just like I did for the headdress. To keep things simple, I'm going to use curves with the array modifier, which is one of the newer additions in recent Blender releases. It's really simple and straightforward to use. I'm going to start by playing with a few different ideas and settings, and in the end, I'm going to use a bit of randomization to get a more natural result. I'm also going to use a mirror modifier in addition to that, so it's easier and more robust to manage. This also helps me avoid having to manually rotate the curve 90 degrees when applying the array modifier. So this is the setup where I have my array and mirror modifiers, and then I'm going to add a bit of thickness to the curves by adjusting the extrusion. I'm going to layer a bunch of curve setups to create the front, middle, and top parts. And you can see that by using the mirror modifier, I get something more consistent, with an angle that makes more sense. The curves aren't twisted based on the angle anymore, so I'm just adding a bunch of them. I don't really care about overlapping at this stage, that's fine, because this is going to be designed for a specific viewpoint. I'm starting to get closer and closer to the final neck feathers, and the overall shape is starting to come together. So now that the neck part is done with the same system I showed you using a curve array and mirror, I'm now starting to work on the earring. I'm going to use a big sphere and add an attachment point as well, with another primitive. By placing the earring, I can see that I need to manage and adjust the position of the neck feathers a bit more. And that's better. Now I can have my earring properly placed and adjust the size, just like with a regular UV sphere. Again, throughout the process, I'm adding a bit more structure and refining the overall composition of the sculpture by adding a few more elements around the neck. For the attachment point of the earring, I'm just using a plane, extruding it a bit, playing with the scale, applying smooth shading and mirroring it. Then I can place it together with the earring. I'm continuing to use the neck feathers around the head and the earring, and I'm pushing the neck area a bit further so it can start transitioning into the arm and clavicle area. This is going to be helpful to hide some of the underlying structure of the neck feathers and improve the overall shape of the piece. So now let's handle the fine details on the head. I'm going to increase the resolution even more, so now I have plenty of resolution to add some really crisp details. I'm starting with the lower eyelid here, adding a bit more shape to it, and doing the same with all these upper areas. Then I'm going to start carving some of the line details. This is where I'm going into the stroke menu and enabling the stabilized stroke checkbox. It's kind of like the lazy mouse that you have in ZBrush but in Blender. Now I can have more control over my strokes and draw really nice clean lines. I'm going to continue doing this for the rest of the mesh. For the eyelids, it's important to have a nice thick line and a relatively flat area around the eye, so you have something solid and consistent, rather than something too soft and flat without any real shape. Mixing the carved brush with the flattened brush can help create something a bit nicer and better defined. The same goes for the other parts, like the eyebrows. Here, I'm just being mindful of the overall shape. If something feels off or goes outside of the intended shape, I'm just going to carve and adjust everything. The eyes are probably the most pleasant and interesting area to work on because we have those squished eyelids that we can really play with. So I'm spending a bit more time on that. Then, around the cheek area, I'm going to adjust this beautiful smile. The same goes for the lips. I'm adding a few wrinkles and small details, even though we know she's nice, young, and beautiful. Without forgetting to use the flattened brush to get those nice, defined details and create a bit of that clay polish look. Alright, we're pretty much done with the sculpting here. We've added all the details we wanted, so now let's focus on the things that are left, like the eyelashes. She has beautiful eyelashes, and to organize and set them up, I'm going to use curves again. This allows me to place them exactly where I want. You can also use, as you can see here, the Snap to Vertex tool, which makes it easier to precisely place the roots of the eyelashes on the mesh. Then it's just a matter of adjusting the curve, adding a few points, and creating that nice curved shape. I'm going to add an intermediate vertex here, and I'm going to change the handle type to vector. This gives us that kind of broken curve that we can see in the reference. Yes, she has beautiful eyelashes, but they have their limits, right? So I'm going to add a bit of roundness and depth to make them thicker. Then we're going to place a bunch of them by duplicating this curve and adjusting the overall curve and flow of all the eyelashes on one side. I'm making sure to check and adjust everything from different angles so the eyelashes sit properly on the character. And that's it. I've got my placement and my curve set up so I can move on to the next step and fine-tune them. So now what I do next is convert that into meshes. But first, I'm going to adjust and tidy up my outliner a bit so I can place everything into the corresponding collections. This is going to make it easier to organize and manage my scene overall. Here I have my teeth, eyelashes, headdress, and neck feathers all properly organized. So back to the eyelashes and the curves. I'm going to merge everything into one piece by using Ctrl+J to join them. Then I'm going to convert them into a mesh, while keeping the original curves in case I need to make some adjustments at any point. I'm also going to mirror the eyelashes based on my symmetry axis, so I can have everything more consistent and properly aligned. Then I'm going to extrude just the top part using extrude along normals, so I can create the thickness that we can see in the reference. And look at that, beautiful Yzma. We have all the elements now, so we can start jumping into the final details before moving on to some painting. The first thing is the details around the eyes and, most importantly, breaking the symmetry. I'm going to apply the mirror modifier on the eyes and adjust the resolution with the Remesh tool. One thing I like to do when it comes to sculpting, to make the eyes and the overall look a bit more interesting, is to sculpt and carve a spherical shape with another one inside it. This helps add a highlight and gives the eyes something that can catch the light and create some interesting shadows. So I'm going to use the inflate brush to sculpt this pupil effect, almost like I'm pushing my thumb into the clay. As you can see, it immediately adds something more interesting. You can also get a better sense of the direction of the character's look, rather than just having a simple point or hole. Once I'm done with the pupils, I'm going to start breaking the symmetry. I'm disabling X symmetry, and now with my brushes, I'm going to adjust each side independently to create a slightly different look, while still staying aligned with the reference. These changes are really minor, but they always make a difference and help give the character a more natural and interesting look. Then I'm just adding the little curly hairs that are coming out of the headdress here. We shouldn't forget about those. I'm continuing to adjust everything a bit, including the placement of the eyelashes now that I've broken the symmetry. And here we are. Our little sculpt of Yzma is finally done. Alright, so now that this sculpt is done with all the elements we needed, we can push it a bit further. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to start by adding some basic materials, and then I'm going to paint specific areas. As you can see, it's quite a simple paint job. We basically want something flat, but with a bit of color variation. So I'm going to show you a few different techniques to achieve that, and many of them are going to use Vertex Paint. First, I'm going to assign a default material and try to match the color of the reference we have here. I'm also going to lower the specular value to have something a bit flatter and closer to a 2D look. I'm going to repeat that across all the different objects we have here with ISMA. And that's it for the basic materials. I've assigned the default material to everything, and I've left a bit more specular on the headdress to add some variation. Then we can jump into something a bit more advanced when we want to paint specific details on top of these materials. So the first way to paint specific areas on top of a material is the same technique I showed you with our sushi cat a few weeks ago, using a setup in the material graph based on the UVs. You will need to add a mix node where one value will be the base color of the material we have here. Then you add a new image texture that you create from scratch and save within the project. I've already created one, as you can see at the top, called Head Paint. So I'm just going to assign that. Otherwise, you can simply create a new image, adjust the resolution, and set the default background color. Then I'm going to plug that into the factor here. Now I can change the color of the factor, and if I paint in texture paint mode, you can see that I can target specific areas. But as you can see, it's limited by the UVs. And we're dealing with a high poly mesh here, so we don't want to spend time properly unwrapping it. It's going to take a long time, and at this point this is more of a concept art or character art process. We don't want to retopologize anything just for the sake of painting. So this is the first method, which works great when you have proper UVs. But how do we handle this on a high poly mesh without having to deal with UVs? Let me show you. So I'm going to get rid of the image texture nodes, and I'm going to use another node to replace them, called color attributes. Color attributes allow me to paint specific areas directly onto the high poly mesh without relying on UV or specific topology. This works through Vertex Paint mode, which you can select here. And then by default, as you can see, I can directly start painting. I get the resolution of the mesh itself, so it's not relying on the UVs in the end. It's just painting directly onto the surface. You can also do a bunch of different operations. For example, you can blur and smooth out the lines, which is really helpful for getting a nice, clean stroke without having to rely on a small voxel size. And with this setup, using the Mix Color node, even if you've already painted your strokes, you can adjust the color afterward. So that's super powerful. This is the workflow we are going to use. Vertex Paint instead of Texture Paint. It's really manageable and the setup is very simple. You just need the color attribute connected to the Mix Color, which then goes into the principled BSDF node. You also have access to a bunch of different brushes with pressure sensitivity if you're using a tablet. That's what I used throughout the process of this video. You can also erase and start fresh at any time. So let me pick the correct color here, and I'm going to start painting the upper eyelid the way I want it. It's basically a classical paint job. You can see that the resolution is quite visible because of the small voxel size of the mesh. This is why afterward I'm going to blur this area a little bit to avoid having such a harsh separation. You could also at some point use edit mode and assign specific face selections with a different material. But here it's more of an artistic character design kind of process, which is something I really like. And that's it for the right eyelid of our beauty here. I'm going to continue adjusting a few things and then we can keep going. I'm going to use exactly the same process for the other areas. Let's continue with the other eyelid using the same process. Painting, adjusting, and being patient. Now that the eyelids are done, let's say I want to add another color on top of these eyelids. Maybe some of the black color around the seam and also the lip color. Because this is all part of the same character and the same material, how can we handle that? We can use another color attribute node. This value is mapped to the attributes that you can find under the Data tab. This is basically a group that we can assign and use with Vertex Paint. You just have to pick the attribute you want at the top here and properly define everything inside the shader editor. If I want another layer, I simply have to create another attribute with the same settings, but first, let me rename this one and reassign it in my shader. You can see that we need a face corner domain and a byte color data type, so let's change the domain and the data type. And I'm going to name this one lower lid because the lower lid is going to have a different color. So let's add it. Now, to correctly layer everything, the idea is really simple. I'm going to duplicate the mix color and color attribute nodes and mix everything on top of each other. With the same setup, I'm plugging the first layer into the B input of the mix color node and the new attribute into the factor input. Then I can define a new color for the A input and plug the result into the base color. If I want another layer, I simply replicate this process. And this is what I'm going to keep doing over and over. Here, I'm picking the correct color, and now I can go back and paint on top of the existing layer. I can add another color or refine the existing one. And that's why Vertex Paint is really useful. You can leverage this tool to paint and quickly design colors for your characters directly on a high poly mesh, without having to rely on retopology or UV. Sometimes I switch to a specific random pass, so I can more easily see the colors and the lines and check if I've forgotten any specific spots. And I continue with the other eye, using exactly the same process. So let's create another attribute for the inner mouth area. I'm adding a new one, changing the type and the domain, and then duplicating the color attribute nodes. I'm assigning the corresponding attribute and mixing it with the logic we already have, then plugging the final result into the base color input of the principled BSDF. Now I'm switching back to Vertex Paint. Don't forget to pick the correct vertex attribute at the top here. And I can start painting with another color. Again, I'm switching between different brushes, blurring out the outline and making everything smoother and more blended with the rest of the surface. All of this is possible through the different brushes available in Vertex Paint. And that's it. Perfect. I'm going to add another color attribute for the black areas around the eyelids, the little curl strand at the top, and also the neck. You can see that here I'm just handling the curly hair at the top. Then, for the eyelids, you can see that thanks to this setup, I can paint on top of an already existing Vertex Paint attribute and color. That's really powerful and super cool. All while sticking to the same setup, using the color attribute node and the mix color node, and accumulating all these different layers in my shader editor. I'm also starting to paint the eyebrows. And what's cool with this whole setup is that by staying with the high poly mesh and keeping this as part of the character design process, I can jump back into sculpt mode at any time and adjust the actual structure of the sculpture, in addition to my painted strokes. That's really cool because I can work on both the shape and the colors, without having to change the whole workflow. Now let's do the other side with the eyebrows, adjusting the stroke a bit in sculpt mode, and then finish with the eyelids on the right side. I'm also going to start doing the same thing with the eyes and the pupils. So let's build the same setup with a color attribute group, a mix color node, and plug that into the existing shader logic. So I'm going to change the color to black and just paint the inner part. I started by trying a few different things, including adding a bit of specular highlight, but in the end I won't go with a completely black look, as you'll see. I'm also going to add another black area on the neck for the beginning of the dress of our dear Isma. Then I'm going to go with full black on the eyes, and we're starting to get something really interesting here. I'm also going to add a bit more depth to the teeth by adding some occlusion, which will help define the individual teeth and give them a bit more shape. So I don't want to, and I didn't want to, paint the teeth manually. This is the setup I used with a color ramp node and an ambient occlusion node. In the color ramp, I added a darker color based on the base color of the teeth. Then, by adjusting the distance in the ambient occlusion node, I can add a bit of occlusion and shadows between the gaps of the actual teeth. This adds a bit more depth and definition overall without having to paint each individual tooth. You can do the same thing for the rest of the sculpt as well, depending on where you want to add more depth and variation, and with that we're pretty much good to go. We can consider the sculpt and basic paint setup done. And this is the final sculpt of our beautiful Isma, all created directly in Blender. I really wanted to show you how easy, flexible and powerful Blender has become when it comes to sculpting, and how you can manage high poly meshes when you're in the character design phase. Blender can handle a lot of triangles now. We were at around 1.1 million triangles just for the head, which is quite a high number. If you've played with Blender a few years ago, it was a bit more difficult to handle this kind of triangle count, so it's really nice to see how far the sculpting workflow has come. I hope this video was helpful and that it inspires you to start sculpting everything directly in Blender. And I can't wait to see what you create. And that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't hesitate to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I see you in 2 weeks for a new one. Ciao!